It should have been our day of blessing, when our dreams would finally come true, but instead it became the moment that would forever change my life. The crystal-clear sky over Valencia was radiating that brilliant Mediterranean blue, just like the ones I remembered from those old postcards my grandmother used to send me. The air carried the intoxicating fragrance of orange blossoms, reminding me of the promise of new beginnings. Joshua and I were approaching our long-awaited dream. That charming house on the outskirts of town that we'd finally earned after years of scrimping and saving, just like my parents had done in their day. My heart was racing as I squeezed Joshua's hand while walking up the entrance path, and I couldn't help but exclaim with pure joy, "Is this really happening? It's finally our home." He returned my excitement with a beaming smile, his eyes reflecting the same overwhelming emotion I felt bubbling up in my chest. He told me with pure happiness that we'd done it, that this was our little piece of paradise. As we crossed the threshold, the creaking hinges sang out like a welcome melody, taking me back to the sound of my childhood home's screen door. Natural light flooded the entrance hall, making the soft cream-colored walls we'd carefully chosen weeks ago glow like warm honey. In my mind, I was already mapping out where every piece of furniture, every painting, and all our cherished mementos would find their perfect place. I gently tugged at Joshua's hand, suggesting we take a look at the garden, my enthusiasm bubbling over like a pot of morning coffee. The terrace left us speechless, our own little slice of Eden spreading before us. There stood a lemon tree heavy with fruit in the corner, and plenty of space for the vegetable garden we'd been dreaming about, just like the one my grandmother used to tend. We were so wrapped up in our bubble of happiness that we didn't notice the taxi stopping in front of our new home. The jarring sound of wheeled suitcases scraping against the pavement broke through our reverie, making us turn around in confusion. There stood Caroline, Joshua's mother, with two enormous suitcases that she was dragging toward the entrance, looking like she was moving in rather than visiting. A sense of tension washed over me, and I felt like time had stopped. My heart was pounding and my face was growing cold. I whispered in a thin voice, "Joshua, why is your mother here?" Joshua, looking just as shocked as I felt, mumbled that he had no idea. We quickly approached just as Caroline reached the door, her designer outfit showing signs of a long journey. Joshua spoke with evident confusion, asking his mother about her unexpected appearance. Caroline raised one eyebrow slightly with her perfectly manicured fingers, a look of mixed disbelief and contempt on her face. She responded in a tone that promised trouble, questioning whether she wasn't allowed to visit her son's new home. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure like my mother had taught me, and answered with a tense smile that of course she was welcome, but we just arrived ourselves. As usual, she looked me over from head to toe, giving me a gaze that was almost judgmental. She mentioned my existence in a cold tone, and I could only bear it in silence. She gestured toward her luggage, asking if we weren't going to help with her bags, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Joshua, ever the peacekeeper like his late father, rushed to pick up the bags. I stood frozen, watching my mother-in-law stride into the house with the certainty of someone who believed everything was rightfully hers. As I followed her inside, I realized that the happiness I had built up until then was slowly crumbling away. Caroline scrutinized every corner of the entrance hall, declaring that while the decoration wasn't bad, there was plenty of room for improvement. My stomach churned and my emotions felt unsettled. We had spent months working out every detail, and her dismissive comment was unexpected and cold. Joshua gently intervened, asking why she hadn't informed us of her arrival so we could have picked her up from the airport. She replied with unsettling casualness that she hadn't wanted to be a bother, adding that she'd wanted it to be a surprise. And what a surprise it was. One that threatened to ruin what should have been the happiest day of our lives. I tried to hide my mounting anxiety as I asked how long she planned to stay. With a cold smile, she broke the news that would change our lives. It wasn't just a visit, she was going to come and live with us. The silence that followed was extremely heavy and unbearable. I searched desperately for some sign that this whole situation was just a joke, but all I found was confusion and panic that matched my own pounding heart. I finally managed to ask what she meant by living here, feeling the words catch in my throat. She replied with an irritating calmness, explaining to me with condescension that this would now be her home too. I felt the ground crumbling beneath my feet, watching our sanctuary, our dream, our promise of a future together dissolving before my eyes. Joshua tried to intervene, telling his mother with a trembling voice that this wasn't something we discussed, reminding her that he and I had bought this house for ourselves. But Carolyn replied, in a polite manner that irritated me, that she knew I wouldn't care because she was her mother. I couldn't bear to listen anymore and turned away, the joy I'd felt walking through our front door now replaced by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. I stared out at the garden with misty eyes, and it seemed as if what had once been a hopeful place was now cruelly crumbling and mocking me. The dry, rhythmic sound of a suitcase rolling across the wooden floor brought me back from my stupor. Caroline was heading upstairs with her bags as if this were the most natural scene in the world. She casually announced she would unpack, adding that we surely had a lot to think about. And with those words, she disappeared upstairs, leaving Joshua and me in a silence that could only be described as complete bewilderment. I turned to my husband, searching for some glimmer of light, an explanation, or at least comfort. But the confusion on his face mirrored mine, and the mix of guilt and embarrassment on his face paralyzed me. Joshua started to call my name, but an inexplicable weight weighed on me and the words stuck in my throat. I held up my hand to interrupt him, whispered to him not to say anything, and ran off to the garden for some fresh air. The once pleasant smell of orange blossom now made her stomach churn. I collapsed onto a stone bench, covering my face with my hands, wondering how this had happened. How had a day meant to mark the beginning of something beautiful become so twisted and unrecognizable? The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted my whirlwind of thoughts. Looking up, I found Joshua standing before me, his eyes filled with worry and tinged with regret. He sat beside me and whispered that everything would be okay, making me a promise. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But as I stood there beneath the Valencian dusk, staring at the horizon bathed in orange and rose, I couldn't shake the conviction that this was only the beginning of something much darker. Night came with a suffocating sense of tension. I barely slept, tossing and turning in bed, my mind imprisoned by the chaos of the previous day. Joshua seemed to share my insomnia, and when dawn came, our tired eyes met, both of us remaining wordless for a long while. Finally, his voice, rough from lack of sleep, broke the silence, suggesting we should go downstairs as his mother would be waiting. I nodded, unable to put my response into words. Walking down the stairs felt surreal, with fresh coffee aroma filling the air. A scent that should have felt comforting now seemed to mock us. For a moment, I pretended this was a normal day, that we were starting our new life alone in our new home. That illusion vanished the moment I opened the kitchen door. There was Caroline, perfectly put together despite the early hour, moving about the kitchen while cooking. When she saw us enter, she turned with an exaggerated, almost artificial smile. She greeted us in an intentionally irritating, sing-song voice, asking about our sleep and announcing she was making breakfast. Joshua carefully responded, trying to tell his mother that she didn't need to do that. She waved the spatula dismissively. Her words, "Be a good host," struck a chord with me, and it felt like I was bleeding from a wound I hadn't noticed in my own home. We sat down at the table in oppressive silence, the only sound being the soft clinking of dishes, a sound that echoed in my head like a countdown to an inevitable explosion. Carolyn either didn't notice the tension or pretended not to notice and continued chattering away cheerfully like a first-day morning radio personality, the brightness of her voice making me uncomfortable. Between bites of the breakfast she'd so strategically prepared, she suggested we should go shopping, implying with calculated precision that the house needed a more mature woman's touch, each word chosen to diminish my efforts in creating our home. Anger welled up in my chest, threatening to destroy my carefully maintained composure, and the feeling grew stronger and stronger. Before I could speak, Joshua stepped in, choosing his words carefully, and suggested we should discuss our stay. Carolyn put her fork down deliberately slowly, her expression going from cheerful to calculating, and the change was unpleasant to watch. She asked me sweetly but meaningfully what I wanted to know, and beneath her innocent tone I could sense a hint of anxiety. Joshua took a deep breath, his chest swelling with an indescribable weight. When he asked about her length of stay, she spoke with confidence, like someone who holds all the cards. With a smile that suggested she'd been planning it for years, as if she was reading from a script she'd prepared long before, she declared that she intended to stay permanently and had already picked a room. My fork fell to my plate with a metallic clang that echoed through the kitchen and matched the anxiety in my mind. "What?" was all I could manage to say in a faint voice. I then felt dizzy and had difficulty keeping my balance. Carolyn continued to explain calmly, but in words that shocked me, she told me that she had chosen the largest room with a view of the garden and a large closet. After that, nobody spoke for a while, and a heavy, tense atmosphere spread throughout the room. I searched Joshua's face for any sign of protest, but he shared my same look of disbelief. Joshua began speaking in an unsteady, emotional voice, revealing tensions stemming from a long and complicated relationship with his mother. He tried to stand firm, explaining that she couldn't unilaterally decide to live here permanently, reminding her that this was our house, bought together, his words carrying both love and desperation. Carolyn answered with a calm, matter-of-fact tone and great conviction. Her expression changed and a look of confusion appeared on her face. She frowned, reminding him in a murmur about his mentions of looking for a larger place, assuming it was for her to move in, her voice carrying the practiced hurt of someone who had perfected emotional manipulation over decades. I was in shock, I was out of breath, and I felt extremely dizzy. Joshua seemed nervous and stammering as he explained our dreams for the future, of having a family that we'd talked about and planned late into the night. His words had a strong impact on me. We had talked about raising children, but that was something we planned for the future, especially not with him living with his mother and ruining all the memories we had. In a calculated move, Carolyn looked deliberately disappointed and, in a pitiful, sweet voice, implied that he was an old nuisance. Joshua began to explain, but Carolyn held up her hand in a determined, commanding manner and interrupted him. The manipulation in her words was so transparent I almost laughed, but Joshua's guilt-ridden expression stopped me. I knew that look all too well, having seen it surface every time his mother wielded her emotional power. Trying to keep my voice calm and emotionless, I entered the conversation and carefully explained that while we weren't talking about a nursing home, this situation was something we hadn't anticipated. Carolyn turned to look at me condescendingly, her gaze cold and sharp. My mother-in-law's words about her relationship with my husband completely evaporated the last of my remaining patience. I felt my composure crack like thin ice under too much weight as I explained that this wasn't about sharing Joshua, it was about her unilateral decision, each word measured despite the tremor in my voice. "Permission," she repeated, her voice cold with years of resentment. The air was instantly filled with tension, with unspoken recriminations and long-held grievances. Joshua was torn between his love for his mother and his loyalty to me, and it was clear from the look on his face that he was struggling with these conflicting emotions. At that moment, watching my husband struggle between two loves, I realized this was more than just a battle over living arrangements, it was a war for our future, and I wasn't sure if anyone could emerge unscathed. Joshua cautiously whispered, suggesting they should try again later, once everyone had calmed down. But Carolyn seemed keen to settle things quickly and wasn't willing to wait. She stood defiantly and declared in a strong, decisive voice that there was no room for negotiation regarding her status as a mother and her need for a place to live, making the already tense atmosphere even more tense with every word. Pleading in an urgent, desperate voice, Joshua tried to explain that the situation wasn't that simple. She fired back with spiteful, precise words, and deliberately cruelty, asking why it was so hard for her to look after her mother, or suggesting that maybe I had convinced her to get rid of her. A burst of intense rage erupted within me, and any composure I had maintained up until then was completely destroyed. How can you accuse me of trying to destroy the mother-child relationship? I stood up too, declaring with forced steadiness that this had nothing to do with me. It was about respecting our space and our life together, my words carrying the weight of suppressed fury. She stared at me with a fierce expression, a look of intense anger in her eyes. She uttered the word respect with disgust and accused me of trying to throw her out of the house while using respect as a pretext. My patience finally wore thin, and I said out loud that no one was trying to kick anyone out, we just wanted to understand why they suddenly had to move in with us. The silence that followed was unbearably oppressive, the weight of unspoken blame. Joshua looked between us, his face a canvas of disbelief and fear, painted with the colors of ancient family dynamics. Caroline appeared wounded now, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow cut deeper than her shouts, saying she just wanted to be near family, asking if that was such a terrible thing. For a moment, guilt peeked into my consciousness like an unwanted visitor, but I clung to the necessity of standing firm. I explained, very carefully, that I understood their desire to live close to each other, but that there was a way to make this happen without disrupting our lives. Joshua finally spoke, his voice heavy with deep sadness. He suggested, with love wrapped in gentle firmness, that we could help her find her own place nearby. Carolyn looked at him with a look of deep disappointment, and her eyes reflected years of built-up expectation. She cleverly uses guilt on him, asking him if he wants to watch her live alone if he refuses to live nearby. Joshua tried to explain, but she was already retreating, her rigid posture as she left the kitchen speaking volumes of hurt and rejection. Over her shoulder, in an eerily quiet voice, she muttered that she understood the situation, that she wasn't welcome and would be leaving by the end of the day. With her words hanging heavy in the air, she walked up the stairs, leaving us in an uncomfortable silence. Joshua broke the stillness with a whisper, confessing his confusion about his mother's behavior, claiming he'd never seen her like this. I had the urge to scream at him about how she'd always been manipulative and that he'd finally realized it, but I held back when I saw the deep sadness on his face. Instead, I suggested, with more gentleness than I felt, that he should talk to her and find out what was really happening. He nodded, his expression a mixture of gratitude and concern for me. Anxiety filled me as I watched him walk up the stairs, his footsteps echoing throughout the otherwise quiet house. The sudden disruption in our lives was so intense that we felt like we didn't have the capacity to cope with the uncertainty. Everything we had imagined, all the meticulous plans and dreams we had for our future together, was on the verge of falling apart before it had even begun. I slumped back on the living room couch, surrounded by moving boxes waiting to be unpacked. The boxes seemed like remnants of a life that may never come to fruition. The unopened cardboard boxes sat there quietly, watching over the final period of our lives. There was loud voices coming from upstairs, and though I couldn't hear the words, I knew that the conversation above Carolyn was changing our lives in irrevocable ways. I shut my eyes tightly and wished that this wasn't all real and that it was just a bad dream. Deep down, though, my gut told me this wasn't the end. It was just the opening act of something far more complicated, a battle to protect our home, our future, and everything we'd built together. I sat motionless on the couch for a long time, letting the quiet moments pass, hoping that if I waited, some answers would come. The voices from above had dropped to whispers, but there was still tension in the air. The situation was becoming more and more unsettling for us. Finally, a creaking sound was heard on the stairs, indicating a temporary lull in the heated argument upstairs. When Joshua first appeared, his face was pale and drained of blood, and his expression showed he was very tired. Carolyn slowly climbed out from behind Joshua, her eyes swollen and red as if she had been crying. In an unsteady, weak voice, Joshua called out my name, Andrea, and told me we needed to talk. I instinctively sat up straighter, steeling myself for what was coming, just like I'd done so many times before in life's tough moments. Carolyn settled into the chair across from me, while Joshua perched hesitantly beside me on the sofa, though maintaining a distance that spoke volumes. You see, he began, rubbing his hands together nervously, a habit he'd had with his old husband. Apparently, there's been a misunderstanding, he said tensely. I looked at him intently and, my heart beating fast and throbbing with excitement and nervousness, quietly urged him to continue. Joshua looked desperately at Carolyn as if she were his last hope, his eyes showing a desperate plea for help and a strong desire to get out of his predicament. She just nodded, encouraging him to continue with what needed to be said. My mother thought of this house as a temporary rental, he said seriously, not a firm purchase. The silence that followed was so heavy and oppressive that it condensed the air in the room to a complete stillness. The silence was so complete that it drowned out even the tiniest sounds in the surrounding area, dominating the entire space. My eyes darted between Carolyn and Joshua, searching their faces for any sign that this was all some cruel joke. How could this possibly be? I finally managed to get the words out, each syllable feeling like a struggle. We've been talking about buying this house for months, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of disbelief. Carolyn began her explanation in an uncharacteristically subdued voice, telling me that when Joshua mentioned moving to a bigger house, she had assumed it was temporary, just until they found a more suitable place where everyone could live. Anger rose inside me like a tide. Everyone could live? I echoed back, keeping my voice steady. Carolyn, we never once discussed you living with us. Not once. She waved her hand dismissively, as if trying to deflect attention, saying she knew and admitted it was her assumption. She asked me to understand that when a mother hears her son is moving to a bigger house, it's only natural to think of herself. I cut her off, unable to contain my anger. Rather than what her son and daughter-in-law want for their own lives? Joshua tried to intervene with a whisper, attempting to calm me down, but I ignored him. No, Joshua, this is ridiculous. Your mother can't just assume she can live with us without even asking. Carolyn straightened her spine, regaining her usual haughty demeanor, and declared that none of this would have happened if her son had been clearer about his intentions. Joshua seemed to sink into the couch as he quietly apologized and said he should have been clearer about our plans. I stared at him in disbelief. You're apologizing? I asked, my voice cold as winter. Joshua, you've done nothing wrong. We don't owe anyone an explanation about our life plans. Once again, a heavy silence fell between us. But then something shifted in Carolyn's expression. Her usually proud face now showed a mixture of embarrassment and fear. Something else was happening, something still unsaid. Carolyn, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. Why did you really think you'd be living with us? Don't tell me it was just a misunderstanding. She exchanged a glance with Joshua, and a silent conversation passed between them. Finally, he nodded, as if giving permission to continue. With a trembling voice, Carolyn admitted she was in trouble. She said she had financial problems. I felt another part of the world crumbling away, like a cliff being carved away by the sea. Suddenly everything made sense. Her unexpected arrival, her insistence on staying, her selection of the largest room. What kind of financial trouble? I asked, already dreading the answer. Carolyn took a deep breath before confessing the truth. She confessed that she was on the brink of bankruptcy. She had lost almost everything. The words rained down on us like a sudden storm. I turned to Joshua, searching his face for surprise, but found only guilt. "You knew?" I whispered, my voice shaking with disbelief. Joshua nodded slowly, unable to meet my eyes, explaining that his mother had told him a few months ago and he had been trying to find a solution. I felt the ground crumble beneath my feet. Not only had Carolyn assumed she could live with us, but Joshua had kept such crucial information from me. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice was heavy with betrayal. He replied weakly that he hadn't wanted to worry me, thinking he could fix it. Carolyn cut in, and with a note of regret in her voice, she said she didn't want to burden me but had nowhere else to go. The weight of Carolyn's words weighed on my chest and my heart sank. Her face showed a mixture of shame and pleading as she struggled to keep her voice steady while explaining. She said she hadn't wanted to be a burden to us. She had thought she could move in, share expenses, help organize the house, and make herself useful somehow. Sharing the costs? I repeated incredulously, as if the word had no place in our conversation. "Carolyn, you just told us you're on the brink of bankruptcy. How did you plan to help us financially?" The silence that followed was extremely heavy and unbearable. Carolyn looked at her trembling hands in her lap and, after a moment of silence, said in a thin voice that she expected us to offer her support, at least until her situation had stabilized. "How did this happen?" I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. "I always thought you were a wealthy woman." She let out a bitter laugh, filled with unfamiliar pain. She explained that yes, she had been wealthy once, but bad decisions, an expensive divorce, and several fatal mistakes had brought her to this point. I looked at Joshua, searching his eyes for answers or comfort that wouldn't come. He seemed as bewildered as I was. "What do you expect from us?" I asked, anger seeping into my voice. "We just bought this house. We have our own debts, our own plans." Carolyn responded with tears in her eyes, saying she understood and wasn't asking for forgiveness for dragging us into her predicament. She simply had no one else to turn to. Finally, Joshua broke his silence. He gently explained that while we loved his mother and wanted to help, this was too big. We needed time to process what she had told us, time to evaluate our options. I nodded quickly, grateful for his intervention. "Yes, this isn't something we can solve right now. We need to think carefully about what's possible and what isn't." Carolyn nodded slowly, wiping away her tears with a handkerchief that was more expensive than practical, and said she understood, and just asked him not to abandon her, that she had made mistakes, but that she was still a part of this family. Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. As I watched her retreat up the stairs to her room with a strange dignity, I felt as if a heavy stone had been placed on my shoulders. Once we were alone, I turned to Joshua, anger and confusion spilling out of me. "Why didn't you tell me anything? Why did you keep this secret?" I demanded. Joshua buried his face in his hands, his voice a faint whisper as he apologized. He explained that he thought he could solve it without involving me, without involving either of us. "But we're a team," I replied. "We're supposed to face these things together. How could you hide something this important?" He looked up, meeting my eyes as he acknowledged that it was a mistake. He admitted he had been scared, not knowing what to do. I sat down beside him, allowing my initial anger to dissipate. "What are we going to do?" I asked. "We can't let your mother end up on the street, but we can't carry this burden indefinitely either." Joshua shook his head, showing the same obvious despair I felt. I found myself saying to Andrea, "I don't know, honey, but we'll figure this out together." Surrounded by unopened moving boxes, I took a moment to appreciate the bitter irony of our situation. What should have been the beginning of an exciting new chapter in our lives had transformed into a whirlwind of family secrets and unexpected responsibilities. As I looked at Joshua, I could see the internal struggle written across his face, torn between his love for me and his duty to his mother. I knew the days ahead would be complicated, filled with difficult decisions and uncomfortable conversations. Yet, as I interlaced my fingers with him, I felt certain that we were facing this together like we'd faced everything else in our marriage. We would find a way through this. For our future and for our family. The next few days were filled with emotional ups and downs that reminded me a lot of raising teenagers. Joshua and I navigated through exhausting discussions, uncertain decisions, and emotions that sometimes threatened to overwhelm us like a tidal wave. But at the core, our commitment to facing everything as a team remained what sustained us through this storm that was just beginning. The tension had been hanging around our house for a long time, showing no signs of going away. It grew heavier with Carolyn's constant presence, each day serving as a quiet reminder of the family storm enveloping us. One morning, as we sat eating breakfast together, barely speaking a word, I decided to confront an issue in this room that could not be ignored. "We can't continue like this," I said firmly, breaking the silence that pervaded the room. Joshua nodded gravely, his face etched with the marks of endless sleepless nights. When he asked what I suggested, I took a deep breath before answering. "I think we need to sit down with your mother and have an honest conversation about her financial situation," I said. "We need complete clarity to understand where we stand and what options we have." Carolyn, who had been silent until then, looked up with an expression that mixed guilt with determination. That afternoon, we gathered in the living room, where Carolyn brought a folder bursting with papers. Her expression was a mix of embarrassment and resignation. "I should start from the beginning," she whispered in a voice that barely carried across the room. What followed was a 2-hour tale filled with unfortunate decisions, failed investments, and desperate attempts to recover losses. She revealed how after her divorce, most of her settlement money vanished in a fraudulent business scheme. In her desperation, she turned to gambling, convinced she could recover her losses. "I thought I could get it all back," she admitted as tears traced paths down her cheeks. Joshua and I listened in stunned silence as the situation she described exceeded any scenario we had imagined. Not only had she lost all her savings, but she had also accumulated significant debt with multiple creditors. When Joshua asked why she hadn't come to us sooner, his voice mixing disbelief with disappointment, Carolyn couldn't meet our eyes. She explained how fear had held her back, how she had always prided herself on her independence. Though I felt frustrated, I couldn't help but feel compassion for her situation. "Carolyn," I said gently, "asking for help doesn't diminish your worth. If anything, it shows strength." Joshua squeezed his mother's hand, emphasizing my words. We spent hours going through the documents. While the situation was serious, it wasn't completely hopeless. "I think we need professional help," I suggested finally, feeling like we at least had a starting point. Joshua agreed with relief, suggesting a financial advisor and considering selling some assets. Though the idea of parting with her possessions pained her, Carolyn eventually accepted it. Over the next few days, we took a series of frantic actions. We contacted a financial advisor recommended by friends and began crafting plans to restructure debt and organize asset sales. But then, like a shadow in the light, another unpleasant truth emerged. Our house, our first real home, suddenly felt too small for the three of us to live comfortably. After many heart-to-heart conversations that left us emotionally drained, Joshua came to me with what he felt was the only solution. He gently suggested that we needed to find a bigger house, one with independent living space for his mother. His words came crashing down on me suddenly, leaving me almost breathless. This house wasn't just a building. It was our dream, our sanctuary that we'd sacrificed so much to obtain. Deep down, though, I knew he was right, as much as it pained me to admit it. Finally, swallowing my pride and fears, I told him I understood, but there had to be ground rules. We needed to establish clear boundaries and expectations right from the start, like creating a constitution for our new family dynamic. Joshua's eyes softened with understanding as he agreed, reminding me that we would tackle this challenge together, as a family. To my surprise, discussing our plans with Carolyn was easier than I'd imagined, like releasing a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Her eyes welled up with tears as she expressed her heartfelt gratitude, promising to do everything in her power not to impose. The next few months were so busy that we barely had time to rest. Between house hunting, selling assets, and constant financial planning, our days became increasingly blurred and lost their clear definition. Gradually, the pieces of our new life began to fall into place. We found a property on the outskirts of town that felt like it was made for us. A spacious main house with a perfect guest house for Carolyn, like our own little compound. The sale of our assets allowed us to make a substantial down payment, significantly reducing our mortgage burden like a weight lifted from our shoulders. During that time, Carolyn felt like she had found a new sense of purpose. She began studying financial management, something I never expected from her, and even secured a position as a part-time advisor. Watching her work so hard to change her circumstances filled me with a newfound respect I'd never felt before. The day we left our first home was like turning the final page of a beloved book, bittersweet and heavy with memories. As I packed up my last belongings and closed the boxes, a feeling of nostalgia quietly washed over me. This house had been our launching pad, the place where our dreams had taken shape and flourished. Seeing Carolyn and Joshua laughing together while packing, I realized something deeper, more profound. We weren't just closing one chapter, we were beginning to write a new one filled with promise. A future where we would become a stronger, more united family, like a rope with 3 intertwined strands. That evening, after settling into our new home, Joshua and I sat on our front porch while Carolyn rested in her cozy cottage nearby. Joshua took my hand and whispered words of gratitude, acknowledging that while this wasn't what we'd planned, he appreciated how I'd handled everything. I squeezed his hand back, feeling a connection deeper than ever before, like roots growing stronger underground. With a smile playing on my lips, I reminded him that we were a team, through thick and thin. Against the backdrop of a sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I reflected on the twists of fate that had led us here. It had been a challenging journey that tested us as a couple, filled with unexpected trials and tribulations. Yet these experiences had taught us valuable lessons about forgiveness, compassion, and the true meaning of family. Challenges still lay ahead, like mountains waiting to be climbed. Carolyn would need time to achieve financial stability, and we would all need to learn to coexist without stepping on each other's toes. It will be an ongoing task that requires constant care and attention. But for the first time in what felt like ages, I truly believed we were moving in the right direction. As I looked at Joshua, I saw in his eyes the same love and determination I felt in my heart, lighting our path forward. Time passed quickly, and life with Carolyn, despite its challenges, had become a part of our daily lives. Despite our efforts to establish clear boundaries, the line between independence and interdependence has often become blurred. One quiet Sunday morning, as Joshua and I were enjoying a peaceful moment in the garden, the creaking of Carolyn's door broke through our serenity. She approached us with a tray of freshly baked treats, cheerfully greeting us like old friends at a coffee shop. I exchanged a look with Joshua, grateful for the gesture, but with an increasing sense of regularity to the repeated interruptions. He accepted the tray while gently reminding her about our agreement regarding Sunday mornings being our private time. Sadness appeared on her face like a cloud on a sunny day, and she apologized, saying she had been obsessed with the recipe and just wanted to share. Seeing her crestfallen expression made my heart twinge with guilt, like a gentle pinch. I suggested we try it together at a family lunch and watched her face light up. After she returned to her cottage, Joshua sighed deeply, expressing his struggle between wanting his mother to feel welcome and our dwindling privacy. I nodded in complete understanding, suggesting we should revisit our discussion about boundaries and expectations. Later, during our family lunch, after enjoying Carolyn's delicious cooking, we discussed the subject carefully. Joshua initiated the conversation with a voice as gentle as a summer breeze yet firm as an oak tree. When Carolyn set down her fork with worried eyes, I quickly intervened, maintaining a calm voice like still waters. The next hour was a time of careful handling of emotions with honesty and empathy, with the utmost care. Carolyn listened carefully, occasionally flashing a look of understanding, her brow softening slightly. Her confession of loneliness surprised us, as did her desire to share the small moments of everyday life. We were so focused on protecting our own independence that we didn't notice her isolation. Joshua took her hand with tender care, promising we'd find a way to make this work for everyone. Little by little, we found the right balance between Carolyn's needs and our own. I squeezed her hand and assured her with heartfelt sincerity that she wasn't alone. We just needed to find our harmony together. After a long, thoughtful conversation and some tears, we came up with a new plan. We established regular mealtimes and commitments while promising to integrate Carolyn more deeply into our daily lives. We suggested she explore social activities and hobbies that would help her build her own space and different friendships. The next few months were a constant process of adjusting and learning to a new rhythm. Carolyn found her place in a neighborhood book club, where words became unexpected friends. She also decided to embrace art, enrolling in painting classes that became her creative sanctuary. For our part, Joshua and I included her more in our weekend park outings and movie nights. Just when we thought we had found a more comfortable rhythm, something unexpected happened to us. One afternoon, while sorting through the mail, my eyes fixed on an envelope from the hospital, making my heart skip a beat. Opening it with trembling fingers, I read the contents and felt my heart pound like a drum. I was pregnant. This news filled me with an indescribable mixture of anticipation and dread. Though Joshua and I had occasionally discussed expanding our family, we'd been postponing the decision due to our situation with Carolyn. It now felt as if the universe had made a choice for us. That evening, after Carolyn had retired to her cottage, I shared the news with Joshua. His eyes lit up with joy, but were soon overshadowed by uncertainty. "This is wonderful," he whispered, holding me close, but we both knew this would bring new challenges. The next day, sitting with Carolyn, we shared our news. Her eyes filled with tears before breaking into a wide smile that lit up her entire face. "I'm going to be a grandmother," she cried, hugging us tightly. Her initial excitement quickly gave way to thoughtful seriousness. When she asked about how we'd manage everything, our conversation was refreshingly honest. To our surprise, Carolyn nodded calmly as we explained, responding with a warmth that touched my heart. Then, with a gentle smile, she added that she'd been thinking it might be time to find her own place. The following weeks became a whirlwind of activity, helping with nursery renovations and apartment hunting for Carolyn. The joy grew, but the days seemed too short to accomplish what needed to be done. The day our daughter Leah was born was a picture-perfect, memorable moment of pure bliss. Holding her for the first time, with Joshua beside me and Carolyn beaming proudly from the corner, I felt a happiness I hadn't known in years. A week later, Carolyn moved into an apartment just minutes from our house. Her absence felt like the disappearance of a familiar sound in a beloved song, but the decision marked the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship. Now she has become a regular visitor and loving grandmother, present but not overwhelming. Looking back, we realize how much we have all changed, like trees that grow with the seasons. What initially seemed like insurmountable chaos transformed into opportunities for growth and strength. We learned to set boundaries without losing love, redefining what family meant to us. Every challenge we faced was a step toward building deeper, more meaningful connections. Now, watching 5-year-old Leia explore the world with endless curiosity, I feel overwhelming gratitude. Our little family found its rhythm, imperfect but stable and joy-filled. Carolyn, now fully independent in her comfortable home, has become an indispensable pillar as a devoted grandmother to Leia and us. But life always has the power to bring about the unexpected, and another unexpected turn of events was in store. One autumn afternoon, as Joshua and I shared coffee on our comfortable living room sofa, unexpected news knocked at our door, promising to change our story once again. The phone broke the silence, ringing with unsettling urgency. A heavy, measured, and serious voice introduced itself on the other end. "Is this Joshua Brown?" After his confirmation, it continued, "This is Dr. Jones from General Hospital. I'm afraid I have concerning news about your father." Joshua's expression changed in an instant. The doctor explained that Joshua's long-estranged father had suffered a severe stroke, leaving him alive but requiring constant care. When Joshua hung up the phone, his eyes were a whirlpool of confusion and sorrow. "Dad," he murmured in a trembling voice, "is very ill. He can't live alone." His words rang out like an echo of disbelief and fear, and my heart gradually sank. I knew the complicated bond between father and son. After the divorce, Timothy, Joshua's father, had immersed himself in work, leaving Joshua with a sense of abandonment that never fully healed. "What do you think we should do?" I asked carefully, taking his hand like steadying a ship in rough waters. He shook his head, lost in a maze of uncertainty. "I don't know. We've barely spoken, but he's still my father." The following days became a chaos of hospital visits, lengthy discussions with doctors, and endless debates about our options. Timothy needed constant care, and our choices were limited like a fork in the road. Either a specialized facility or our home. "I can't put him in a facility," Joshua said one night while little Leia slept. "Even if we weren't close, he's still my father." I felt a knot in my stomach like a tightly wound rope. We'd barely found stability, and the thought of disrupting it frightened me. But seeing the determination mixed with pain in his eyes, I knew we had no real choice. "We can prepare the study for him," I finally suggested. "It's on the ground floor with its own bathroom." The grateful expression that lit his face confirmed we'd made the right decision, though we knew it wouldn't be easy. Our next conversation with Carolyn worried us. Given the past with Timothy, we feared she might struggle to accept this situation. But surprisingly, she showed unexpected maturity that took our breath away. "Timothy and I certainly had our differences," she said thoughtfully, "but he's Joshua's father. If he needs help, we need to be there." Her words stunned me. This woman was worlds apart from the one who'd entered our lives with unhealed wounds. The following weeks swept us into a whirlwind of preparations, transforming the study into a functional room and hiring nurses for daytime care. The day Timothy arrived, the house felt charged with emotion like the air before a storm. His wheelchair-bound figure, thinner and more vulnerable than we'd ever seen, hit us like an invisible fist. Leia, too young to understand it all, watched with curiosity, trying to decode this grandfather she barely knew. "Welcome home, Dad," Joshua said gently, forcing a smile as he pushed the wheelchair inside. "Thank you, son," Timothy replied weakly, the words struggling to form. The first few days were very stressful for everyone. Timothy showed frustration and moodiness as he faced his new reality. Joshua is torn between old grudges and a new sense of duty, and is troubled by conflicting emotions. One afternoon, as Joshua helped his father with rehabilitation exercises, Timothy began to cry. "I'm sorry," he whispered between sobs that shook his frail body. "I wasn't a good father. I don't deserve this." His words fell like heavy stones in still water. Joshua froze for a moment, stunned by the vulnerability of a man who once seemed unshakable. Finally, he placed a hand on his father's shoulder and said, "What matters is that you're here now." That moment marked the beginning of a change. Father and son slowly began the work of rebuilding a bridge that had been long broken. At first there was an awkward silence, but gradually the conversation became more natural. Carolyn, to our amazement, became an unexpected ally in this journey of healing. She put past hostility aside and became a frequent visitor to Timothy's study, helping him with his rehabilitation and accompanying him. Watching these once opposing figures find common ground became a lesson in forgiveness and growth. Leah, with her childlike innocence, became a spark of joy in her grandfather's life. Her drawings and stories filled the days with color and laughter, illuminating even the darkest moments. Despite these flashes of light, not everything has been easy. Difficult days, marked by accumulated tension and the weight of our responsibilities, were inevitable. Caring for Timothy, working and raising Leah required a delicate balance and was a constant challenge. One night, after a particularly draining day, Joshua and I sat on our old wooden terrace with only the evening breeze for company. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Joshua whispered, his voice carrying a weariness that wasn't just physical. I squeezed his hand, conveying an understanding that needed no words. "I know it's hard," I responded gently, "but think about how this has changed us, connected us in ways we never imagined." And I, as a real-life truther, was right. Despite the adversity, our family was blooming through the trials. Carolyn and Timothy, once seemingly irreconcilable opponents, now shared a relationship built on foundations of forgiveness and empathy. Joshua was healing old wounds with his father, while Leah grew surrounded by love that felt stronger and more authentic each day. As time passed, we began finding our rhythm. We learned to balance everyone's needs, communicate more clearly, and support each other when things got complicated. One spring afternoon, watching Leah playfully running around the garden with Timothy, a thought crossed my mind. What once seemed like an unbearable burden had transformed into an opportunity to rediscover love and heal old wounds. Looking at Joshua, I saw the same wonder in his eyes that I felt in my heart. Our family, with all its imperfections and challenges, had transformed into something deeply beautiful and resilient. We had confidence that we could overcome all odds, and while we understood that challenges would continue, we knew that together we could face them. This house, once a reflection of individual dreams, had become a sanctuary. Listening to Leah's laughter, Carolyn and Joshua's animated conversations, and seeing the quiet joy on Timothy's face, we knew we had created something special. Our story, shaped by adversity and love, is richer and more beautiful than we could have ever imagined. Time marched forward relentlessly, and by Leah's 10th birthday, a decade of joy, challenges, and growth had passed like seasons changing. Timothy had shown signs of improvement against all odds, though he still needed constant care. Carolyn had become a pillar of stability for all of us, while Leah continued to grow before our eyes, full of curiosity and compassion. Yet life, with its unpredictable nature, had prepared another trial for us. One crisp spring morning, as we shared breakfast as a family, Joshua's phone rang, heralding the beginning of a new chapter. "Is this Joshua Brown?" the voice on the other end inquired. "This is Logan Smith from Global Innovations. I have a proposition that might interest you." I could see emotions flickering across Joshua's face like shadows. First curiosity, then surprise, and finally a mixture of enthusiasm and concern. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression I found hard to decipher. "Andrea," he said, his voice trembling like a leaf, "they want me to work at their headquarters in New York. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." The silence that followed was overwhelming, like a heavy blanket settling over us. Leah, who had been excitedly discussing birthday party plans, suddenly fell quiet, sensing the tension in the air. Carolyn and Timothy exchanged glances that reflected their uncertainty. New York? I managed to say, the words feeling foreign on my tongue, but what about our life here? Joshua ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his nervousness. I know, it's unbelievable, he said, but this could change everything. The salary, benefits, the possibility of giving Leia an incredible education. The following days became endless evening discussions after Leia went to bed, Joshua and I sitting together, weighing every argument. Think about what we could give our daughter, he argued, the experiences, culture, museums. But I countered, what about our family here? Your father, your mother. They've been through so much with us. The decision hung over us like a gray cloud, and we knew either choice would require sacrifice. But unknowingly, Leia helped us find clarity, like a lighthouse in the fog. One night, as I tucked her in, she looked at me with those deep brown eyes and asked, Mom, why is everyone so sad lately? I sighed, searching for ways to explain, well, sweetheart, Daddy's been offered an important job, but it's very far away. We're trying to decide what's best for our family. On a summer evening, with the sounds of the town filling the air, we gathered in the living room to discuss our future. Leia, with her intense gaze and slight frown, broke the silence. What about Grandpa Timothy, Grandma Carolyn, and my school friends? She asked with a genuine concern that shook me to my core. In that moment, I realized I'd overlooked how this rushed decision for tomorrow would affect our daughter. I don't know, sweetheart, I answered honestly, feeling the weight of our uncertainty. Leia remained quiet for a while, as if trying to process everything. Then she said something we hadn't expected. My teacher told us about families who come from other places. Sometimes they're apart, but that doesn't mean they stop loving each other. There are lots of ways to be a family, even if everyone doesn't live in the same place. Her words were simple but filled with unexpected wisdom that took my breath away. I had been so focused on physical togetherness that I'd forgotten how heart connections transcend any distance. That night, I shared her insight with Joshua, and together we reached our conclusion. That weekend, we gathered for what would become one of the most pivotal family meetings of our lives. There we sat in our familiar living room, the same place where we'd shared countless family moments over the years. My eyes moved across the faces I held so dear, Leia, Timothy, Caroline, Joshua, and myself. I could feel the tension thick in the air, like a heavy blanket, as Joshua cleared his throat to speak. My heart skipped when he began talking about the opportunity in New York, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility I'd watched him bear for so long. He told us, with such genuine concern, that he couldn't make this decision without all of us. Timothy was the first to break through the tension, his voice stronger than I'd heard in years, echoing off the walls of our well-worn living room. He told our son that we couldn't let him sacrifice this chance for our sake, admitting that while he and Caroline had made their mistakes, they couldn't let Joshua compromise his future to care for them. Next to him, Caroline sat with tears glistening in her eyes, nodding in agreement. She backed Timothy up with gentle determination in her voice, reminding us of all Joshua and I had already done for them. She insisted it was time to focus on us and little Leia. I watched as Joshua's voice trembled with emotion, asking about his father's continuing need for care. That's when Caroline surprised us all with her declaration. With a determination I hadn't seen in her for years, she announced she could take care of Timothy. She explained they'd discussed living together again, supporting each other just like in the old days. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Joshua's incredulous laughter. When he asked if they were really going to live together again, Timothy's response came with a genuine smile that softened the wrinkles on his face. His words about life being too short to cling to the past resonated deeply with me, especially knowing how painfully they'd learned that lesson. I turned my attention to Leia, who'd been listening intently throughout the discussion. When I asked what she thought, my precious one, she took a moment, biting her lip in that endearing way of hers. Her eyes sparkled as she finally spoke about this being an adventure, reminding us how her teacher said we could talk and see each other every day through the internet, even from far away. Her youthful optimism filled my heart with such pride and hope for our future. The following months flew by in a whirlwind of preparations, barely giving us time to process the magnitude of the changes ahead. We threw ourselves into arranging the move, selling the house, and planning Timothy and Caroline's care routine. When the departure day finally arrived, we all gathered at the airport, our hearts too full for words. Caroline moved from one to another of us, giving tight hugs and whispering that this wasn't goodbye, but just until we met again. Timothy, seated in his wheelchair, reached for Joshua's hand with such fatherly pride. His voice cracked with emotion as he told his son how proud he was, urging him to go conquer the world. As we boarded the plane with Leia, she could barely contain her excitement, bouncing between us with pure joy. I was overcome with a mixture of fear and hope. As we left behind the home we'd built with years of effort and dedication, I knew we were carrying something far more precious with us. We took with us the unconditional love of our family, a treasure more valuable than any brick and mortar could ever be. As the plane climbed toward an unknown horizon, carrying our lives toward a new beginning, a profound understanding washed over me. We have overcome difficult challenges together and learned that distance cannot break the bonds of family. We were discovering that love flows freely beyond physical location. We have come to understand that sometimes growth means having the courage to step out into the unknown with faith and begin something new. New York was waiting for us, a city of skyscrapers and bustling streets. This was the beginning of a new story, a chapter we would write together, strengthened by the challenges we had faced and the love that had sustained us. With the city lights twinkling in the distance, I knew the road would not be easy, but I felt ready to face it together.